December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, Hawaiian Territory, 0745 hours. The brass bell of the USS Arizona gleamed in the early morning sun as Quartermaster Third Class Robert Chen polished its surface with methodical precision. The Pacific waters lapped gently against the battleship's hull, creating a rhythmic whisper that had become the soundtrack of peacetime naval routine. Coffee steam drifted from the galley below, mixing with the salt-tinged air as seagulls wheeled overhead in lazy circles. Chen paused in his work, wiping perspiration from his brow as he admired the mirror finish of the ship's bell, a bell that would ring no more warnings, for in 90 minutes it would lie beneath 20 feet of oil-slicked harbor water, silenced forever by the opening salvo of Japan's Pacific War. The attack on Pearl Harbor was more than a tactical strike against the American Pacific Fleet. It was the manifestation of Japanese strategic philosophy distilled into its purest form. For 2 centuries, Japanese military doctrine had been built upon the concept of the decisive battle, the single, overwhelming engagement that would crush enemy morale and secure total victory. The samurai tradition that still coursed through the veins of Japan's officer corps demanded direct confrontation, honorable combat, and the spiritual purification that came through facing death with unwavering courage. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood better than most the industrial capacity of the American enemy he was awakening, but even his warnings were swept aside in the euphoria of early victory. What the Japanese Imperial High Command could not foresee was that America would refuse to fight their war. Instead of seeking the climactic naval engagement that would validate Japanese concepts of honorable warfare, American strategists would craft something entirely alien to the Japanese military mind, a systematic campaign of advance and bypass that would render Japan's most heavily fortified positions irrelevant through the simple expedient of ignoring them. This island-hopping strategy would prove to be the philosophical antithesis of everything Japanese doctrine held sacred. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific with the confidence born of spiritual certainty. They fortified islands from the Marshalls to the Solomons, transforming coral atolls into fortress complexes that would make the Americans pay in blood for every yard of sacred soil. On Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura supervised the construction of tunnels and bunkers that could house 100,000 troops. At Truk Lagoon, Admiral Chuichihara commanded what he proudly called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, a naval base protected by rings of anti-aircraft guns and defended by 50,000 men. On dozens of smaller atolls, Japanese commanders prepared for the glorious last stands that would bleed the American advance white against impregnable defenses. But when the American counter-offensive began in earnest, it arrived wearing an unexpected face. On November 20th, 1943, the first American amphibious assault struck Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The 4,500 Japanese defenders, commanded by Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had spent months preparing for this moment. They had tunneled deep into the coral, constructed interlocking fields of fire, and sworn the sacred oath that not one American would survive to set foot on their beach. Shibasaki himself had boasted that 1 million Americans fighting for 100 years could not take Tarawa. The battle lasted 76 hours. When the guns fell silent, 17 Japanese soldiers remained alive. The Americans had paid dearly, over 3,000 casualties in 3 days, but they had demonstrated something that would haunt Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war. American industrial capacity could absorb such losses and emerge stronger, like a forest fire that clears the undergrowth to make room for new growth. More disturbing to Japanese planners was what happened next. Instead of grinding forward island by island, as Japanese doctrine insisted they must, the Americans simply sailed past Bypass Island and its 11,000-man garrison. They ignored the fortress of Wotje, where Colonel Yuki Sato had spent 8 months preparing elaborate defenses. Most shocking of all, they bypassed Truk itself, the naval base that Japan had considered the key to Pacific defense. The sound that would come to symbolize American strategic thinking was not the thunderous bombardment of fortress walls, but the steady drone of transport aircraft, Douglas C-47 Skytrains, carrying supplies to newly captured airfields while Japanese garrisons withered in isolation. The psychological impact of this strategy on Japanese commanders cannot be overstated. These were men trained from childhood in the warrior tradition, educated in military academies where the decisive battle held almost religious significance. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commanding the fortress of Peleliu, wrote in his personal diary, "We have prepared for glorious death, for the honor of making the enemy pay dearly for our sacred soil. But they sail past our brothers on neighboring islands as if these men do not exist. This is not war as we understand it. This is something that defies the natural order of military honor." That something was the manifestation of American industrial democracy applied to warfare, where Japanese military culture emphasized spiritual strength and the nobility of individual sacrifice. American strategy relied on overwhelming material superiority and systematic efficiency. The statistics reveal the breathtaking disparity in productive capacity. By 1944, American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class aircraft carrier every month, while Japan's entire naval construction program struggled to replace losses from previous engagements. The United States produced 296,429 aircraft during the war years. Japan managed 76,320. American steel production in 1943 alone exceeded Japan's total output for the entire conflict. This material abundance allowed American commanders to think in ways that Japanese military philosophy simply could not accommodate. When Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur planned their Pacific campaigns, they possessed sufficient resources to maintain multiple, simultaneous operations across thousands of miles of ocean. They could afford to bypass enemy strongholds because their industrial base provided the luxury of choice, a concept foreign to Japanese planners operating under conditions of increasing scarcity. The isolation of Japanese island garrisons created a unique form of psychological warfare that no military manual had anticipated. On Bypass Island, Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Miyauchi maintained a detailed diary that American intelligence would recover after the war. His entries chronicle the gradual transformation from confident defender to forgotten relic. Day 89 since the American fleet passed our position. Radio contact with Imperial Fleet headquarters grows weaker each day. The men continue to ask when the decisive battle will come, when we will have our opportunity to die gloriously for His Imperial Majesty. I no longer know what answer to give them. As months passed, Miyauchi's entries reveal the corrosive effect of strategic irrelevance. Day 203. American aircraft fly overhead daily, but they no longer bother to attack our positions. We have become ghosts, forgotten by both sides. The men grow restless. Some speak of surrender, a word I never thought to hear from Japanese lips. Others maintain discipline through ritual and routine, but I see doubt in their eyes. We prepared for death in battle, not this slow dissolution of purpose. The transformation in Japanese strategic thinking became evident in the increasingly desperate measures adopted during the war's middle phase. The same generals who had dismissed American island hopping as cowardly began implementing their own indirect tactics. The kamikaze campaign represented a twisted reflection of American efficiency. Instead of overwhelming through material production, Japan would overwhelm through expenditure of human life. But even this grim calculus revealed the extent of Japanese strategic bankruptcy. Where Americans could replace losses through industrial production, Japanese pilots represented irreplaceable assets squandered in single-use attacks. The symbolic power of the C-47 transport aircraft became increasingly significant as the Pacific War progressed. These twin-engine workhorses carried more than supplies. They carried the sound of a different kind of civilization, While Japanese garrisons counted individual cartridges and rationed rice grain by grain, American forces received regular deliveries of not just military necessities, but luxuries that demonstrated the depth of American abundance. Cases of Coca-Cola, ice cream mix, fresh bread, and even equipment for USO shows arrived at forward airstrips with clockwork regularity. Japanese intelligence officers, intercepting American radio communications, expressed bewilderment at supply requests that included musical instruments, sporting equipment, and materials for base newspapers. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, monitoring American communications from Rabaul, wrote in his intelligence summary, "The enemy treats war as if it were a camping expedition. They request not just ammunition and medical supplies, but entertainment, comfort items, and what they call morale boosters. Do they not understand the sacred nature of combat? Do they feel no shame in their luxury while engaged in mortal struggle?" This incomprehension extended to the highest levels of Japanese command. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the brilliant defender of Iwo Jima, perhaps understood the implications better than most of his colleagues. In letters to his wife, intercepted and translated after the war, he wrote, "The Americans do not fight as we anticipated. They seek no honor in individual combat, no glory in death. They approach war like an engineering problem, methodical, relentless, supplied by an industrial capacity that appears without limit. We prepared our souls to face warriors. Instead, we face technicians with unlimited resources." The mathematical inevitability of American victory became apparent in the progression of island campaigns throughout 1944 and 1945. Tarawa had cost 3 days and 3,000 American casualties. The Marshall Islands fell in 4 days with 500 American dead. The Marianas Campaign, involving multiple simultaneous amphibious landings, was completed in 3 weeks. Each successive operation demonstrated increasing efficiency as American commanders refined their techniques, while Japanese defensive capabilities steadily deteriorated. The strategic blindness of Japanese leadership extended beyond simple miscalculation. It represented a fundamental incompatibility between worldviews. Japanese military culture, rooted in concepts of Bushido, spiritual strength, and the decisive engagement, could not adequately process an enemy that treated warfare as an industrial problem to be solved through efficient application of resources. American commanders spoke of production schedules, logistical pipelines, and resource allocation, while their Japanese counterparts planned for spiritual victories and glorious deaths. This philosophical divide became tragically apparent in the fate of isolated Japanese garrisons across the Pacific. On Truk, Admiral Hara maintained his headquarters in elaborate underground bunkers, surrounded by the rusting hulks of ships and aircraft that had once represented Japanese naval supremacy. His forces, numbering nearly 50,000 at their peak, gradually wasted away not through combat but through disease, malnutrition, and the psychological strain of military irrelevance. American bombers occasionally visited to suppress any signs of activity, but largely Truk was simply ignored, a demonstration of how thoroughly American strategy had marginalized Japanese defensive preparations. The human cost of Japanese strategic miscalculation extended beyond military casualties to encompass civilian populations trapped on bypassed islands. On Bypass Island, nearly 20,000 Korean laborers had been brought in to construct fortifications and airfields. When American forces sailed past without attacking, these workers found themselves prisoners of geography, unable to return home and unwilling to participate in what increasingly appeared to be a futile defense. Their presence complicated Japanese planning and strained already inadequate supplies, creating additional stress on garrison commanders who had expected to face external enemies, not internal management crises. The steady drone of American transport aircraft carried more than material supplies. It carried the sound of a different kind of civilization, one that suggested suffering was not necessary for victory. that strategic objectives could be achieved through superior organization and material abundance rather than spiritual purification through hardship. This message proved more corrosive to Japanese morale than direct combat could achieve. Soldiers could prepare mentally for death in battle. They were less equipped to handle the psychological challenge of slow starvation while listening to daily reminders of enemy prosperity passing overhead. By early 1945, the collapse of Japanese strategic assumptions was complete. The American island hopping campaign had advanced Allied forces to within bombing range of the Japanese home islands, while leaving 13 major Japanese strongholds isolated and militarily irrelevant. These bypassed garrisons containing over 200,000 troops and millions of tons of military equipment represented nearly a quarter of Japan's overseas military strength, rendered effectively useless through American strategic innovation. The resources invested in these positions, concrete, steel, artillery pieces, trained personnel, and months of construction effort, had been neutralized without the climactic battles Japanese doctrine demanded. The final irony lay in the continued preparation for decisive engagement, even as American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself. On isolated atolls across the Pacific, Japanese commanders still drilled their men for glorious last stands, polished weapons, and maintained the spiritual discipline necessary for honorable death, while above them flew the constant reminder that their enemy had found a way to achieve victory without honoring their sacrifice with the dignity of combat. The island-hopping strategy revealed a fundamental truth about modern warfare and the societies that wage it. The Japanese had expected to fight a war that would validate their cultural values, honor spiritual strength, the nobility of sacrifice in service to the emperor. Instead, they discovered that their enemy possessed the ultimate luxury of any advanced industrial civilization, the ability to choose how and where to fight. American abundance had purchased not just material superiority, but strategic flexibility that allowed victory without validation of enemy assumptions about honorable combat. The gentle drone of those transport aircraft had become the soundtrack of American victory. Not the dramatic crescendo of decisive battle, but the steady, methodical rhythm of industrial democracy, solving a military problem through patient application of overwhelming resources. The bypassed islands remain today as monuments to strategic miscalculation, coral atolls where rusting Japanese artillery pieces still point seaward, waiting for an enemy fleet that found a different route to victory. In their silence, they testify to the power of a system that could afford to ignore challenges rather than meet them directly, that could achieve strategic objectives through abundance rather than sacrifice, and that understood war not as a test of spiritual purity, but as a problem requiring the efficient application of superior resources to achieve decisive political outcomes. The final irony of Japanese strategic blindness manifested in their continued preparation for decisive engagement, even as American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself. On isolated atolls scattered across the Pacific, Japanese commanders still conducted daily drills, maintained weapon inventories, and preserved the spiritual discipline necessary for honorable death in battle. Above them, the constant drone of American aircraft served as daily reminder that their enemy had discovered how to achieve victory without honoring their sacrifice with the dignity of combat. The island-hopping campaign revealed fundamental truths about modern warfare and the societies that wage it. Japan had expected to fight a war that would validate their cultural values, honor spiritual strength, the nobility of sacrifice in service to divine emperor. Instead, they discovered that their enemy possessed the ultimate luxury of advanced industrial civilization, the ability to choose how, where, and when to fight. American abundance had purchased not merely material superiority, but strategic flexibility that allowed victory without validation of enemy assumptions about honorable warfare. The gentle drone of those C-47 transport aircraft had become the soundtrack of American victory. Not the dramatic crescendo of decisive battle that Japanese military culture demanded, but the steady, methodical rhythm of industrial democracy solving a strategic problem through patient application of overwhelming resources. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized spiritual purification through suffering, American strategy demonstrated that victory could be achieved through systematic efficiency and material abundance. Today, the bypassed islands remain as monuments to strategic miscalculation, coral atolls where rusting Japanese artillery pieces still point seaward, waiting eternally for enemy fleets that found different routes to victory. In their silence, they testify to the power of a system that could afford to ignore challenges rather than meet them directly, that could achieve strategic objectives through abundance rather than sacrifice, and that understood war not as spiritual contest, but as problem requiring efficient application of superior resources to achieve decisive political outcomes. The echo of those transport engines, carrying supplies to American forces advancing toward Japan itself, carries the same message today that it delivered 75 years ago. That true strategic flexibility comes not from superior courage or spiritual strength, but from the industrial capacity to choose one's battles rather than accept those imposed by the enemy.